First, I think let's just start off. Vince, we'll start with you, and we'll sort of just go down the row. You guys say a little bit about why you're here and where your interests are.
Great, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Vince Hall. I'm the CEO of Feeding San Diego. We are a part of Feeding America, and our jurisdiction is San Diego County. Feeding San Diego is very different than most of the Feeding America network in that we are really focused almost exclusively on rescuing food that is already in our communities every day and getting that to families in need. Unlike most traditional food banks, we do not receive any federal commodities. We don't receive federal funding for distributing federal commodities. We don't receive state funding to purchase food. Almost all of the food that Feeding San Diego is distributing in the community is rescued food. So there's a lot of layers to that, and we can unpack that more, but essentially I'm very proud to lead a very innovative organization that is not just a leading hunger relief organization, but is also, by virtue of the way it does its work, a leading environmental organization.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Evelyn Rangel-Medina, and I'm the Chief of Staff of the Restaurant Opportunity Centers. And we're a national organization that's led by immigrants, people of color, women, and low-wage workers around the country. We have 2 worker centers here in California, one in LA and one in the Bay Area. For the last 2 years, I led the Bay Area Center, and our work is really focused around creating sustainability, sustainable practices for workers, and making sure that not only that they have access to a living wage, but that they can access those rights by having the tools, the organizing, and the access and the advocacy to be able to advocate for themselves and be able to access courts and administrative processes so that they can access either wage theft or redress their rights for discrimination. And at a national level, we're working to eliminate the sub-minimum wage. Almost every state in the country has a sub-minimum wage for tip workers that really keeps workers, especially women, and the head of households in poverty wages, starting at $2.13 an hour. And we're building a movement, a one fair wage movement, to be able to make sure that the people who are preparing our food and serving our food around the country have access to a dignified wage and good working conditions.
Hi everyone, I'm Jen Burney. I am faculty at UC San Diego next door, so it's delightful to be down the street. And I'm an environmental scientist. My research group does work trying to understand what our food production, processing, and consumption emits into the atmosphere, and what those climate changes then do in turn to our ability to grow food, so the impacts of climate and air pollution on food production. And then we also do work with farmers in different areas across the world in different types of ecosystems to understand how they do and can best adapt to climate changes.
Good. Hi, my name is Mike Hamm. I'm on the faculty at Michigan State University. I wore my New Orleans socks in honor of Danny. And because I was thinking when David Bronner was on the stage that I'm from the Midwest and I would never wear that on the stage in the Midwest. The communities in the Midwest might not accept it. But at any rate, I've spent 16 years at Michigan State as the C.S. Mott Professor of Sustainable Agriculture. My PhD is in human nutrition, though I don't have a background in agriculture per se. Before that, I was 19 years at Rutgers. And there, in about the last 10 years I was there, I worked with a group of students to start a student organic farm at Rutgers that still goes and is almost 25 years old now. And it's always been student run and operated. And I worked to start a program called the New Jersey Urban Ecology Program. We worked in schools and in communities to start community gardens and school gardens. And we started a program called the Youth Farm Stand Program that the Attorney General of New Jersey picked up to work with their adjudicated youth to sell fruits and vegetables in limited resource communities around the state. And then I moved to Michigan State, where I hold that position that I mentioned, and was the founding director of the Center for Regional Food Systems. So my research and my outreach and my engagement is focused on local and regional food systems, mostly in the US, but also with some work in Malawi and some work in Europe.
Let's start sort of generally, and I want to direct this question first to you, Michael. Do you think that most Americans are happy with their food options?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Are most people happy with their food options? Well, I think it's hard to say most people in the United States because we have something like 20% of the population that is relatively food insecure. And so my guess is that they're very unhappy with their food options in large part because they don't have enough money. I mean, the SNAP program or food stamps is only designed to cover 60% of their food needs. And even at that, it doesn't provide sufficient foods for fruits and vegetables and things like that. So a large segment of the population is buying, in general, this is not complete, but in general, as cheap a food as they can with high calorie content. And that's a very smart decision when you have limited resources in many ways. I think there's another segment of the population that does very well and is doing better and better that is in love with their food options because now we've got farm-to-table restaurants in Lansing, Michigan, where I am. We've got one of my farmer friends sells to 12 restaurants in the area and can't keep up with demand. So we've got farm-to-table restaurants across the country, and I think that people who can afford it are very happy with their food choices by and large. And then I think we've got the broad swath of America in the middle that is increasingly struggling and using coupons as much as possible. And that said, something like 50% of the population of the United States buys something organic on a regular basis. And so I think there's increasing interest in the food supply across a broad swath of America. I think there's increasing uncertainty about its safety and what it does to the environment and what it does to labor and what it does to animals. And I think there's a fair bit of frustration at their inability to purchase all the foods that they would like to.
Well, Michael, you bring up a good point, and I think, Vince, you should probably answer this because your organization is dealing with this. But not everyone can afford organic, free-range, sustainable foods. And how are you and how is your organization promoting good nutrition, healthy eating with sort of limited resources for a lot of these folks?
Yeah, I appreciate comments that were made even at the beginning of today's summit from audience members about the social justice side of food justice and the fact that the system as we have developed it today leaves massive inequities that fall along socioeconomic lines, that fall along gender and racial lines. And so one of the things that Feeding San Diego has done to try to promote nutrition and to make healthy foods accessible to disadvantaged communities is 85% of what comes through our distribution center is fresh produce. And I don't sure there's another hunger relief organization of our size, 26 million meals last year, that can make that claim. But we are sourcing through the California Association of Food Banks Farm to Family program from over 220 farms and packing houses up and down the state of California. We're getting potatoes from Idaho, apples from Washington. Our neighbors to the south in Mexico are exporting a lot of food to the U.S., and we're able to recover food that is surplus from that process. And then we're distributing that food through 150 charitable organizations across the county, in addition to 100 locations that we operate ourselves directly. Logistically, it is extraordinarily complicated to run that large a scale of fresh produce distribution. But ethically, it's an imperative for the hunger relief movement if it's going to be more relevant to solving these larger problems in our society.
You know, we are feeding more people than ever before, but it is coming at a cost, right? Like, we're balancing quality versus quantity, and that, Jennifer, is having an impact, obviously, on the environment as well.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one thing I'd like to encourage us to do here is to think about certainly our local and regional food ecosystem, our national food ecosystem, but also globally, right? Around the world, different communities, different regions find themselves in sort of different situations in terms of food security. There are still vast swaths of the world where hundreds of millions of people go to bed, without having consumed enough calories on any given day. And so there is a large chunk of the world that is contending with basic deficits in things like commodity crops. That's obviously not where we are in the United States, even though still, 1 in 5 kids in the U.S. is food insecure in some dimension. So there's a part of the world where we really need to think about growing more food, indeed, because most food, in spite of all the talk about globalized food systems, most food is really consumed fairly close to where it was produced in the world. some of it is wasted, and we're doing a lot of work to address that, obviously. But I think if we think about environmental impacts, there's a part of the world where we really need to still think about what it means to produce more food and what that would do to the environment, and then here locally thinking about what it would mean to consume food in a more equitable, just and healthy way. So those have very different environmental footprints that we are trying to balance, like you say.
And Evelyn, do you think, I mean, sometimes it's so overwhelming, right, to think about it, like we're here, what can we do? How can we sort of reach this global impact? Is there anything that everyday people can do in order, to do something about, to help other people?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us are deeply involved and invested in the restaurant industry. How many of you went out to eat last week or this week, right? So if you look around, almost every single one of us go out and eat to a restaurant. And so it's really important to think about the actual cost of labor to not only bring that food to the restaurant, but actually the people who produce the food, who cook it, who serve it. And the reality is that 5 of the 10 lowest paid jobs in the United States are in the restaurant industry. And it's not an accident that particularly here in California, this industry, the backbone of this industry is immigrant labor. It's primarily people of color, and it's primarily Latinos and Latinas who carry this industry, who make sure that not only we are fed, but that we have a positive experience in our food to table, in almost every section of the restaurant industry. And so as consumers, we can really push this industry to change its practices. California is one of the 7 states that actually has a one wage for tip workers and non-tip workers. So unlike most of the rest of the country, we're a little bit ahead in making sure that people are not getting paid as low as $2.13 an hour. But we're still a long way ahead in racial equity. For example, in the Bay Area, we have the widest racial wage gap than any other part of the country when it comes to the restaurant industry. So even though we have some of the highest wages in the country, we still have a long way to go in making policies and regulations that actually protect the most vulnerable workers. And that's something that we can do. One of the things that we're doing with a couple of restaurants that we're partnering with is really pushing them to implement racial equity practices. But if it's not coming from the consumers, if we're not asking why are all the waiters in the front white, primarily white males, and why are all the people in the back who are earning less, people of color, when we're going to eat into these like fancier restaurants, then we're not doing our job as consumers in thinking about the people who are part of our ecosystem, but who are not sitting at the table with us.
What's the responsibility, Michael, of large food corporations in America? I think, we were talking about different countries, but I think in America here, right, we just have these huge food companies. What's their responsibility and what role can they play? They should be playing a larger role, probably.
Well, we should all be playing a larger role. I mean, the food system is a perfect example of how we externalize virtually every cost that we can so that it makes the supply chain cheaper, and what we pay either at the grocery store or in the restaurant is relatively cheap. And so, so everything is externalized. And what could and what should large corporations do, or what should large companies do, or what should anybody be doing? It's to internalize those costs. I mean, we should be doing it with our federal policy and our state policy, and we should be doing it with our corporate policy. And if corporate policy isn't going to do it, then government policy should be forcing them to do it. And so when we talk about pesticide residues, or we talk about animal welfare, or we talk about phosphorus running down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico and creating a huge dead zone every summer that's larger than several states in the country, and there's add-on effects to that to then shrimp farmers in the Gulf of Mexico. So everything that we can do, we externalize, and we internalize only the things that we have to. And so, corporations should be internalizing those costs just as we should as a society, so that we know what the true cost of these things are. And then we have to figure out strategies, because then the cost of food, for example, does go up, probably on average. And so that means that there's a larger swath of America that is unable to afford that food. And so now we have to have broader strategies for making sure that food is available to them, to everybody in the country, that food is a right and not a privilege.
Yeah, what do we do about those possible, well, we've seen them, food increases after we have these major changes in the food industry? We do see prices rise, and Vince, that's a problem. That's definitely a challenge.
It really is. I mean, it's stunning to think about the fact that 40% of the food that is produced, distributed, and brought to market in this country ends up being wasted, which is more than enough to solve hunger across the United States if it was paired with an efficient recovery and distribution apparatus. And so we're in a situation where we have grown up thinking of food as a scarce resource, right? So we created these nonprofits called food banks, which is two very unusual words to put together. But the idea was we're going to create a repository like a seed bank or a financial bank or a blood bank, and we're going to put this precious commodity in it, and we're going to withdraw very slowly and carefully so we don't overdraw it. When in fact, when you look at it objectively, food is a surplus in our society. There's more food than is necessary to solve the problem, but we've created instrumentalities of public policy that seek more funding to buy more new food which just enlarges the very new food production system that already generates 40% waste. And so what we're looking to do is to acknowledge the massive, massive investment of environmental resources that go into producing our food already. We're talking about 4 trillion gallons of water, 800 million pounds of pesticides, 2 billion pounds of fertilizer, 30 million acres of farmland, all of that dedicated to just growing the food we throw away. And then you square that up against what happens when you put that organic into the landfill, which becomes a leading generator of methane gas and contributes to global warming. And so we are just doing incredible devastation to our environmental policy on both sides of that equation. And then our solution is to create these central repositories where massive numbers of trucks are hauling product into centralized buildings, which are then backhauling it back to the neighborhoods from which that food was recovered, creating a ever larger carbon footprint in the name of solving hunger. So this is, in our view, a very dysfunctional approach to the system. And so Feeding San Diego believes that it's really pioneering a way to decentralize food recovery and hunger relief, to minimize the environmental effects of the hunger relief process, but also to capitalize on the investment of the resources that was made to create and grow that food and ship it to our communities. So it's a different way of looking at the problem. It's a clean sheet of paper way of thinking. San Diego is a place of innovation. It's a place of inventing the future. And we feel like we've assembled a really smart team of young people who are looking at this problem from a whole new way and devising an entirely new solution.
Jennifer, did you want to add on to that?
Just give a clap.
Well, people always sort of talk about this this looming food crisis, that's in the future. Is there a looming food crisis? Are we in it? So what do you guys think?
Maybe we can characterize the food crisis on a number of different dimensions, or a potentially forthcoming food crisis on a number of different dimensions. So there are still a couple of regions in the world where food availability creates periodic crises. So the Horn of Africa is one such region, right, where droughts really precipitate a lack of local food availability, and people go hungry and die. So that's one type of crisis, and we do think that the likelihood of drought in semi-arid regions around the world is likely to go up under climate change. So that's a type of problem, sort of seasonal drought-driven food shortages that have very important local consequences. We do think that is a type of crisis that will still exist and will into the future, and needs certain types of policies, right? Smart redistribution from regional resources, aid in the form of money as opposed to commodity shipments that helps both redistribute food regionally along the lines of sort of what's been talked about here, and also help farmers survive these crises where they're not only hit on the food security side, but also on the income side, right? So that's one type of crisis, sort of food availability driven crisis. I think the other thing is we have, and maybe you could speak about this more, really a food availability versus nutrition crisis, where I think for many decades of worry about food insecurity, we focused in national agricultural policies on producing more commodities and just ensuring net caloric availability. And so now for the past few decades has seen the greatest decline of people sort of in that state of caloric insufficiency ever. It's been tremendous, the number of people who've been lifted out of that type of food insecurity. But many of those people who now have enough to eat in terms of calories every day do not have enough to eat in terms of protein or micronutrients. And we see that in the United States a lot. A lot of low-income communities, disproportionately communities of color, do not have access to the types of micronutrients, fruits and vegetables, and protein sources that would be adequate for nutrition security, either because they live in places that are removed from stores that provide these, or economically excluded from the marketplace. So I would say there's a bit of a food security versus nutrition security crisis that is affecting many regions around the world. And I think the third dimension would be a food justice crisis, right? We, as Evelyn said, we are no longer in a world where everyone is producing what they consume or interacting in a very local marketplace to get the rest of their consumption basket. We're in a world where people get a lot of food in prepared form from restaurants and other types of establishments like that. And so the labor costs have been driven down by policies aimed at communities who largely can't fight them, and or haven't been able to in the past, thanks to Evelyn's work now doing it more successfully. But I think the sort of food justice surrounding the broader labor implications of our food system is the third dimension to what I would say is a crisis that needs addressing.
Anyone want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think it's, depending on the zip code, definitely the color of your skin and the access that you have, you experience a food crisis. I mean, we see that across the country where, we have mothers, the heads of households, earning between $2 and $4 an hour, depending on the consumer, to pay for your wages, experiencing 3 times the rate of sexual harassment in states that don't have, that have at least the minimum wage for tip workers in order to be able to sustain themselves and their families. So we definitely do see that as a food crisis, as a justice issue that the people who are serving our food are experiencing across the country, and a huge reluctance of our policymakers to change that. To give you an example, in Washington, D.C., restaurant workers organized to pass a ballot initiative, collected thousands of signatures to eliminate the sub-minimum wage. We eliminated it successfully in the city council, a primarily Democratic body, it's not even Republican, overturned the ballot initiative because they were heavily lobbied by the Restaurant Association. And so when you have people who are sustaining themselves in poverty wages, who have very little access to high quality, nutritious food, except for what they're serving to the people that at their jobs, and who are relying on those people to actually pay their wages because they're earning so little that all of their actual wages are going to taxes. And we have the policymakers overturning the will of the voters. That's the kind of power that we have to fight against, and that we're constantly facing, not only in Washington, D.C., we're working on a similar measure in New York, in Michigan, but it's really important for us to think about of how these policies are affecting the working people and the people who are putting food on our tables.
And I think you bring up a good point. Your organization is doing some really good work when it comes to trying to make some policy change. Do you think, though, that the average person, like you were saying, that's going to the restaurant, they think about all of these things? I think, at least in California, there's definitely more of an awareness about this, but do you think there's still a lot of work to be done in that arena in terms of public perception?
Yes, and that's why I feel like a lot of the progress that the food justice movement has done can really, and food sustainable movement has done, can really be replicated and like connected, right, interconnected with labor rights and workers' rights, because how many of you think about when you go to a state like New York, or you travel to Washington, D.C., or you travel to Florida, that your tip is paying for the actual wages of worker versus in California where they're paying less? I didn't think about that before working at Rock. Like, I thought, well, if I live a $10 tip in Florida, it's going to be added to their wages. But no, right? In Florida, tip workers are getting paid, I think, like $3 an hour. And in California, tip workers should be getting paid at least the minimum wage that the local city has or that the state has, which is about $12 or $13 an hour, and it's going to go to $15 by 2020. So no, there isn't like a lot of consumer awareness around this, and I think that for the demand that's been created from like farm to table, for sustainable, for organic food is the same demand that we can create as consumers for fair and equitable labor practices, so that we don't have an industry that relies on the extraction and the exploitation of workers in order to feed us, but that we have an industry that actually treats people with dignity, that allows the people that are serving us to sustain themselves and their families and to afford high quality food. And we can create that demand. That's part of the work that we're doing, because if this is a consumer-driven industry, it's one of the fastest growing industries in the country. We're fastly becoming a service-based economy, then we can also be the answer to creating that demand and hold the folks who don't want to change accountable for their terrible labor practices.
I think if anyone has any questions in the audience, we want to take them now, and you can direct them to someone specifically. And go ahead, sir. There is someone with a microphone coming down.
Hi, you spoke of a nutritional crisis, but isn't one of the real consequences of cheap food health crisis that's a result of that? Eating all those empty calories in terms of diabetes, obesity, diabetes, that's really, you're saving one place and paying in another.
Yeah, so food and nutrition security can occur in different combinations. So overconsumption of calories can result in obesity, diabetes, things like this. And you can find within the same individual, right, those kinds of conditions along with micronutrient insecurity. So not getting enough micronutrients. So you can have countervailing problems within an individual. Certainly we see it within households in different combinations. Overnourished and undernourished at the same time within the same household, and we see it, sort of across spatial scales as you go up. So it is a very complicated problem. They don't necessarily move hand in hand, and I think there are some policies that help them move better hand in hand, thinking about what SNAP looks like and what kinds of benefits are extended to people who are the most price sensitive, for example, in the United States, would go a long way towards helping that, but they are almost two axes that can move independently.
Right. If I can just add a related point, there's a lot of focus now in the hunger relief movement about the synergies between healthcare and food insecurity, and our medical care system is very guided toward writing prescriptions and to doing surgeries and to authorizing therapies and treatments. It's not very proficient at diagnosing food insecurity, even though nutrition is the most fundamental and essential building block of human health. Your ability to recover from trauma, to recover from disease, starts with your access to good, healthy, nutritious diets. And so I want to hat tip to UCSD Healthcare, who have partnered with Feeding San Diego, and we are now operating various programs which aim toward solving that problem, including when 30 to 40% of the food insecure population is dealing with type 2 diabetes. And so these programs aim to actually provide those communities with food that is diabetes compatible and helps them to improve their overall health condition, as well as training and other aspects of their diet and continual ongoing support for their diet. So UCSD and Sharp Healthcare and other organizations are really looking at this in a very serious way as a part of the overall healthcare approach.
Right. And the other thing to keep track of is that although food and agriculture both sit inside USDA, there's absolutely no coherence in policy between any of them. So I was a consultant to the last Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee around sustainability, and helped write the 20-page section in that report, which was then, of course, taken out because of a huge amount of political pressure. And what became clear is that if you look at, if we had coherence, then our policy around health would be oriented, especially as it relates to food, would be oriented around a healthy diet that had less meat and less calories and more fruits and vegetables and more whole grains. That would open up, that would close some opportunities in agriculture, and it would open up many others. If we now had coherence in our agricultural policy, I did a calculation once which looked at you can get about 6,200 calories of olive oil, of corn oil out of a bushel of corn. You get about 42,000 calories of high fructose corn syrup out of a bushel of corn. If you take the average excess calories that Americans eat in a year and figure it out, it's about 2.3 million acres of corn that we produce just so that we consume excess calories. Well, that 2.3 million acres, we can think of that in the Mississippi Valley as unerodible land. If we put that erodible land into permanent cover crop and stop the flow of sediment and phosphorus down the Mississippi, we can block about 85% of the phosphorus flow down the Mississippi. We can then eliminate the dead zone. We then reduce the production of meat, and maybe our agricultural policy is that anywhere that animals are finished, the waste from those animals has to be recycled to the land. That disperses animals much more broadly across the countryside because you're not going to be able to effectively ship that much manure from some of these really high-density CAFO facilities that we have, say, in Oklahoma and Kansas and places like that. So coherence around health and agriculture is absolutely critical for getting out of the hole that we've dug ourselves into, and it's a really deep hole.
If I may add one thing to that, I think it's true there's a lack of coherence. However, there's a foothold of hope. And this is something where I think people in this room can get involved, right? The Farm Bill is one of the few large omnibus bipartisan packages that passes every 5, 6, 7 years. It's up for renegotiation now. We don't really know when it's going to happen. But this is the package that puts both all of our farm support, food policy, conservation policy related to agriculture, and SNAP and nutrition-related programs together into one bundle. So there is a foothold in which the way that we are able to pass policy is to put these two sides of the equation together. And I think, for the people in this room, you're a self-selected bunch who obviously understand the need to think about this in a holistic sense. And as the Farm Bill comes up again the next time, this is an opportunity to do so and to call your representatives and to make sure you demonstrate that you understand that all sides of this need to be considered together and to get involved. Farm Bill sounds really unsexy to a lot of people, but this is like a huge opportunity to get involved in it. It really directs policy for large, half decadal chunks of time.
Any other questions? We have one back there.
Hi, yes. So California recently passed a number of new policies like the Homemade Food Operations Act, which allow for micro-enterprise home kitchens, and expanded street vending laws. How do you see these new policies playing a role in sustainable food systems and encouraging entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I can speak to it.
I can too, but go ahead.
I think if you look at the organizations that advocated for those policies, it's indicative of the need to create some regulations around practices that were already in the community. So a lot of these practices come from immigrant households that have an entrepreneurial spirit and already had micro food businesses running in their community, but didn't have access to either access to a license or the ability to be able to expand their business because of the limitations on or the restrictions on being able to run their business. And so I do think that it's a positive step for California, and it's creating a model for the rest of the country, especially around like street vendorship access, because it's a way that folks who have very little access to capital can access a pathway to create capital for themselves and don't have to necessarily engage in a work or employer relationship. And it's also a way to create more economic stability, especially in an era where people of color, low-income people in cities are being profoundly displaced in California. That is connected to food is the biggest crisis that we face as a people currently, where, I lived 10 years in the Bay Area, and within a period of 4 years, it saw the immense displacement, especially of Black people out of Oakland. And we see that in cities, it's replicated in cities around the state. And policies like that can create just a possibility for people to stay in the place, in the communities that they built, the communities that they're a part of. And I wanted to highlight that because it's something so connected to food, and the solutions that we build now are going to impact us for generations, and it's so important to think about it and not think about just food as a one issue, but as an entire ecosystem that's affecting people.
And Michigan passed a similar law about 6 years ago or so for sales at farmers markets. And what's been found over the years, and at one point they raised the threshold of income before you had to be producing in a certified kitchen. And what we found over the years is that a lot of people have used that as a way, like you were saying, to start businesses. And then we have an entity at MSU that works through extension across the state called the Product Center. And they have innovation counselors in the counties that will help people who want to build food businesses, food and natural resource businesses, kind of start to scale up. So some of them have taken kind of what they did with sales at the farmers markets and worked with innovation counselors and found incubator kitchens where they could start to produce at larger scale and are starting businesses. So it's a pathway either to have kind of add-on income for your family or for your household and stay at that smaller scale. And a few at least have started to scale up to become a larger business that would sell outside of those markets too. So I think it's a good thing.
Do we have any other questions? Back there.
Hi, I'm an integrative nutritionist actually at UCSD, and I'm glad somebody brought up the Farm Bill. This is something in my career over the last 20 years that comes up and I think is placed as a false glimmer of hope. I think that as activists, and many people in this room know that we can call our representatives day and night, but as long as they are in the back pocket of industrial food, we're not going to get anywhere. So I'd like to hear what the panel has to say about getting that corporate money out of politics.
Good question.
Well, yeah. So I'm going to say something first because I'm not from here. I'm from Michigan. And I live in a heavily gerrymandered Republican district called the Michigan 8th. And we just elected a Democrat, Elisa Slotkin, who, as part of her campaign, took absolutely no PAC money and no corporate money, and yet had the most well-funded campaign in Michigan because of all of the individual donations. And she has said her highest priority, she's got two high priorities when she's in, now she's there, I guess, with the training sessions and all that. One is to get the money out of politics, get politics back to the people, and the second is healthcare. So, we've sent her an email saying that we will continue to support you as long as you stick to that. So I think that's what we do, and I think we've got a lot of young, new Congress people that are going there, and I think we need to keep the pressure on them and do that. So,
Yeah,
I don't know.
We've seen a few models of what that looks like in the most recent election, and it looks like the first set of bills that that House leadership wants to put forward is aimed at this, right? Automatic voter registration, expanding voter access, and reducing the amount of money in politics. So, hopefully, that is some optimism. I nevertheless think that we all have to acknowledge the political economy of legislation and how it gets passed, right? Enough stakeholders nationally have to agree to the Farm Bill, and that's why these things get lumped together, because it cobbles together a bunch of groups who might, fall disproportionately on sort of one end of this sort of multi-sided issue. And I do think that is beautiful. There aren't enough examples of that where we can put together enough interests in a package of laws that speaks to, there's no issue, right, that more unites all of us than what we eat every day. And so I have to think that there is a hook in there for hope. So I hope that you find hope in the recent results, but I also hope you don't give up hope on the idea of omnibus legislation that can speak to all these issues at once.
Okay, I see this big flashing red sign behind us. So I think our time is done, unfortunately. But I want to thank everyone that joined us on the panel today. Thank you so much for your insight and for all of your really great questions. Thank you.